Kia ora and welcome to Context with me, Corin, Dann.
And me, Guyon, Espiner. Context is the backstory to the front page, where we take an issue that's making news today and we trace its long shadow to figure out how it was that we got to where we are today.
Of course, there's a twist, as there always is. One of us knows the topic, one of us does not know the topic. This week it is me.
So
yes.
What have you got to drop on me today?
We are going to talk about strikes. We're going to talk about industrial action, industrial relations reform, strikes, because over the last few weeks we've seen quite a bit of strike action in this country. The senior doctors, you've got teachers, there's been nurses striking. So let's just have a little listen and a little reminder of some of the action out on the picket lines.
There's one thing that's clear to me. People here have unity.
They need to invest in teachers because we are the frontline soldiers.
The bargaining seats were barely warm by the time they decided to go on their strike. It looks extraordinarily like it was premeditated.
A 1% pay rise is pretty ridiculous.
It's not so much striking for pay today, but for conditions for nurses.
So we've seen a little bit of striking action, but it's important to sort of, as we start off on this journey, to remember that actually strike action is pretty low at the moment compared to our history. Just for context, I think we saw a bit of a blip in strikes in 2018. There was 143 stoppages. They do record it. Last year, though, there were only 47. If you go back into the 70s, it was like 562 work stoppages in 1977.
Wow.
1980, there were 360.
Wow.
So quite a contrast.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get to this, but when you talk about strikes in the 70s, my mind immediately goes to being, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 in the late 70s, and you're waiting for the Cook Strait ferry to leave, and it would leave Littleton. I lived in Christchurch at the time, and, you were going to Wellington on the Cook Strait ferry, you leave from Wellington, and then, of course, there'd be an announcement to come across and there'd been a strike and you weren't going anywhere and you'd stay on board. That happened quite a bit. So
It did, and that was one of the ones, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
And as I investigated this, it was clear that, and that's one of the ones people remember.
Is that
Ferries
right?
really irritated people.
Yeah.
And one of the ones, and they struggled to get public support because people were getting stranded in the South Island. And in fact, the government actually ran a few operations to step in and try and get people back and fly them back.
And are we going to talk about
things.
Jim Knox at some point?
We're going to talk about Jim Knox.
Okay, I'll let
there
you
is
go.
a cast of incredible characters.
Yeah,
incredible.
Great. This is going to be fun. I don't know a lot,
characters.
but it's going to be fun.
This is before I want to start. This is an interesting point, and I think we should give people context about us because we are Gen. Well, I'm Gen X. You're Gen X.
Yeah,
we're
I'm
Gen X.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but you're a couple of years older than me, but my first experience in the proper workforce, working in a cafe, so not like after-school job, but a proper job in a cafe in Christchurch in, would have been 92 or 93. Now, I started in a world where unions had just been, and we'll get to all of this, unions had been crushed effectively by the Employment Contracts Act. The world changed. So my understanding of the workplace and is of a world where I only ever known the Employment Contracts Act, where it's all on the individual. That's what they tried to do with it.
Pretty much me too. That was the Bolger government, wasn't it? So very early.
Yes.
It might be 91, the Employment Contracts Act, can't quite remember, but it's pretty close to around that point, isn't it? So it was that national government under Jim Bolger.
What was your first job? Can you remember?
So, it would be similar. I mean, I only worked really in a world of individual employment contracts as well. I mean, I had a few jobs at university, late high school and things, but when I went into the workforce of, journalism, which is pretty much all I've ever done, there was a union called JAGPRO. I don't know if you remember that, but that was a journalists and printers union and things, and I was in that for a bit, but then I quickly moved on to an individual employment contract. Don't know what that says about me, but you'll make your mind up.
Well, we didn't know anything else. That's the point, I guess, what I'm making. And there'll be people listening to this who will have much more of a lived experience with unions because they were in the 70s and 80s, but right back. Looking at the history of this, they were a huge part of New Zealand life. Much. Nearly half of all workers at its peak in the 80s were part of unions. And even if you weren't part of the union, if you were in an industry where there'd been a collective agreement formed and an award issued whereby there'd been some arbitration or a mediation or whatever, and they decided that the industry had to have minimum standards, you got them anyway. So you were affected, you were heavily influenced regardless.
Yeah,
and
I
that
guess
changed overnight.
We'll probably come to this in how you unfurl this, but we had compulsory unionism, didn't we? And I was going to say till the 1980s we had compulsory unionism.
Well, basically, it was Bolger's Act that pretty much got rid of it. Pretty much got rid of that. All right, let's go right back then. Let's go right back then to what I guess we would say there was probably a little bit of industrial action pre this, but the first major strike in New Zealand was in 1890, and this was called the Maritime Strike. And it was basically about 8,000 wharfies and watersiders on the ports who walked off the job. A guy called John Miller called it in solidarity with Australia. And it went for 3 months and it ended in total defeat for the unions. They got completely wiped out on it. They didn't get anywhere. But why it's significant was that it led to some legislation that the Seddon government passed. A Labour minister called William Pember Reeves was the Labour minister at the time. He's a socialist, editor of the Littleton Times, apparently, from Christchurch. And he passed the piece of legislation called the Industrial Conciliation Arbitration Act in 1894, which the bones of it basically set up a system for arbitration. If you were a union, you could just sign up to the deal, and the employers, and they sat down and that got... If there was a dispute, it was sorted out via arbitration, and then you had to accept it. And the bones of that system ended up lasting for another nigh on 80 years.
Wow!
So that's the underlying context of that. And what's interesting is that it worked for a while. So New Zealand got a reputation as a place that was apparently known as the nation without strikes, because for a while it suited everyone to have a panel. Firstly, it was a local panel, and if that didn't work, it went to a national panel, and they would decide on the pay and the conditions. And if the union had signed up and their employers were in, that was it. It got set. You didn't have a choice. You couldn't strike if you were in the arbitration process. But, and this is where it starts to get interesting, and we'll get through the history relatively quickly here because there's quite a bit to get through. 1906, Labour's leader comes out to New Zealand from England. He wasn't impressed. This is Ramsay MacDonald says trade unions in New Zealand exist mainly to get an award out of the arbitration court. They cannot strike. It's no good. So he didn't like it.
The Brits are very keen on unions, eh? I don't know if you, but when I was in unions early in journalism, it was always a British man who was.
Well, it's hard not to have Billy Bragg ringing in your ears, isn't it?
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I mean that's the weird thing, isn't it? In the 80s, when I was growing up, it was like for some reason we got a lot of Billy Bragg singing about.
Well, your
dad
was a big musician fan, eh?
Absolutely,
yeah, so
absolutely.
You probably got a bit.
And
of
I'll blame my brother Liam. He would have introduced me to it for sure. He's the musicologist.
Yeah.
And then of course we get to the next point, and this is one you might be able to help me out a little bit on. 1908. Black Ball Miners' Strike. Does that ring any bells for you?
Well, not really, but I mean, I know that is considered the birthplace of the Labour Party, isn't it?
Yes,
so
it is.
I know that much, but I don't know much more about the strike. Although obviously they've had very strong union representation right through. In New Zealand
it often crops up in speeches and things from Labour candidates. What happened was, so you've got this arbitration system that's working in New Zealand, where effectively the unions that there were going into arbitration with employers. They were sorting out their pay deals and basically coming up with standards for all these different industries, port workers, etc. So there wasn't any striking, but people started to get grumpy, and so some unions broke away and decided not to go into arbitration, and they started to go on their own and do their own deals with bosses. Now this started, basically it was Black Ball where this started, because a strike broke out. And it broke out over meal breaks.
Right.
There's a guy, Pat Hickey, another great, sounding union bloke, Pat Hickey. The bosses at the Black Ball mine wanted to restrict miners to 15 minutes a day to eat their lunch. They called it their crib. I don't know why, but they called it anyway. So 15 minutes to eat their lunch. And the union went, stuff that we're going to challenge this arbitration system. We're just actually going to go out on strike over this because they also wanted to extend the 8-hour day to 10 hours. So the union goes on strike. Pat Hickey refuses to eat his pie at lunchtime. And for 3 months, these miners refused to work. And then eventually the union, the employers, the boss, the mine owners caved. And the union won. And this was seen as a huge blow to that original system of arbitration where everyone played nicely and went into the system and sorted it all out, because the union, when it had gone out on its own, and it created the forefather of the Federation of... the
FOL, the Federation of Labour,
yes, the
right?
Federation of Labour, exactly.
Yeah,
and
they were a big force right up into the 70s and 80s, weren't they?
Huge. And that was seen as the founding part of that. They were labelled the Red Feds. That was the
So is that the link, is it, to the Labour Party?
Correct.
Yeah.
And then it was about 1916 we saw the Labour Party. So it's seen as the precursor to that movement. That Red Feds movement was where people think that the Labour Party kicked off. But things started to get really pretty full on in New Zealand. I mean, you think about the time then, 1912, pre-World War I. It's a pretty revolutionary period. You think of America, you think of Russia, you think of all around the world, communism, socialism, all those things are really starting to take hold, and workers are all around the world, really.
Yes.
And it was no different here. Waihi strikes in 1912. This was over gold miners. So this was another situation where there was a union that wasn't part of the arbitration system. So the employers tried to get around that by bringing in what was called scab labour. That's the obviously.
Oh yeah, that's a term
the
that
nasty
you don't want to be called, isn't
term.
it? Yeah.
If you are coming in to break a strike, work for people who are on strike.
Yeah.
So effectively, that's what happened there, and the mines owners did that by creating a new union that was in the arbitration system. They went out on strike. Now, this was pretty much the only strike where someone was killed. It got violent. And on November 12th, 1912, events came to a head. It was called Black Tuesday. And I think basically there was scab workers brought in. I don't know if I'm supposed to use that term like that.
I'm sure it'll offend someone. But
it feels like it does feel like quite a powerful sort of harsh word. But non-union workers came, farmhands, people like this, they came in and then they got protection, and it turned out that there was some fights between the unionists and the non-unionists. The non-unionists attacked a hall where there was some people staying. Fred Evans, a striking miner, was badly beaten allegedly by police and special constables. Special constables being, who knows, strike breakers, sworn in as police.
Wow.
Sustained head injuries and died. So
Wow. Didn't know that.
That was pretty serious. And I'm going to quickly move through to 1913 because they're kind of linked, but there was a big strike. Wharf strike mainly, 16,000 strikers, ports in Christchurch, Auckland, Wellington. And this is where you may have heard of Massey's Cossacks.
Oh, yes, yes, I have, yes.
So again, the strike kicks off. These guys aren't prepared to work. Massey brings in guys on horseback with batons that are effectively farm workers sworn in as constables, and it gets pretty violent, and they effectively break the strike. But let's have a little listen to some people reminiscing on this. It's from a Spectrum, 1972 RNZ Spectrum. Marjorie Lees recalling that 1913 strike.
Now, your father's attitude was it was the French Revolution, but did he have can you remember his political feeling about there being a strike?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, the waterside workers were less than the dust. It was absolutely wicked of them to strike. They were damaging the country. I mean, they had no case at all as far as he was concerned. The special constables rode about all through the town, especially up in the slums where most of the waterside workers lived, and their wives were supposed to empty chamber pots over them and various things like that. And it was really...
These were the tales you heard?
Yes, these were the tales I heard about the wicked strikers and so on.
You can just imagine New Zealand back then, eh? It was a pretty pretty volatile place. I mean, the idea that it was, it wasn't all plain sailing, that it was just going to turn out as it did.
Yeah, and it's that ultimate battle of capital versus labour, really, isn't it? That's how it was seen.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes through here, to me, is you can see how in times of economic prosperity, things fade away, and or when labour's short and the unions have power, or when the employers have the power, and you can see the swings in balance, and then you can see how governments have tried to respond with legislation to deal with that. I mean, I'll give you an example. I thought this was incredible. So as part of that original arbitration system, and there was a few tweaks along the way, but effectively they could issue general wage orders. And so they set it up in 1921, they passed some sort of legislation, but in 1931, of course this is in the Depression, so New Zealand's in a real slump, they issued a general wage order to cut all wages by 10%, and they did that.
Really? Wow.
Now, can you imagine? It's an interesting response, though, because if you think about, what do you think? Because it's like, if you think about COVID, when COVID hit, and some of the radical responses that people were thinking we needed to do, because there's a country, you're in the shtuck. So what did we do in COVID? We borrowed like crazy, printed money, did whatever we could. But I guess one response back then was
take a haircut on your pay.
Take a massive wage cut.
Wow.
Of course, there were huge protests about it, but and it's arguable. It was one of the factors that then led into the 1935 Labour government, the Savage government, which came in, and they did bolster, I'm going to get through this a bit quickly, that they did bolster the arbitration system. They certainly made union membership compulsory, like you mentioned, and any worker covered by an agreement, say you worked in a cafe or whatever, and even if you weren't in the union, if there was an award for cafe workers,
right,
and
you were
set
covered
minimum
by
standards,
it. So that's where the compulsory,
whether you liked it or not.
right. So that's where the compulsory unionism started, really, was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Now, this is where we get to, arguably one of the most contentious periods in New Zealand history, full stop, let alone strikes, and that is the 1951 waterfront strike. Any ideas on how long that lasted?
No, the touchstone for me of the waterfront strike was the first snap election. I think there was a snap election associated with that.
Yes, there was.
Gosh, did it last? It would have been several months, would it? Would it even a year?
151 days.
Okay, so about half a year. Well, not quite.
And it brought the country to an absolute standstill. Let's have a listen to the Prime Minister of the day, who went really hard, Sid Holland.
The maintenance of law and order in normal times is a matter for the police force, which is limited in its numbers, and in times of emergency such as this, we cannot leave everything to them. Cabinet, therefore, has decided to establish a civil emergency organisation of loyal citizens which will stand with the government in carrying out any task the emergency may require in protecting life and property.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
the law that emergency legislation they passed there, if you pass that today, I just don't think you could. But I'll get to that. Let's lay that very quickly. So what happened was you've got post-war, New Zealand's booming, you've got the Korean War boom,
yes.
You've got a lot of money, but it coincides with the rise of militant unions, unions that are far further to the left and are much more aggressive in terms of their pay demands. So that was the Watersiders. They were going their own way. They didn't get the same pay rise that everyone else was getting, which was 15%. They walked out and went on strike. Of course, they were incredibly powerful on the ports in terms of all the wool and everything that's going across there. And the national government of the time, it responded by passing emergency legislation. They brought in the army to try and unload the ships. They weren't particularly successful, but they did that. But what is extraordinary is that emergency legislation, nobody could, complete censorship of the press, you could not write anything in support of the strikes
Is
at
that
all.
right?
Nothing.
Wow.
It was very strict. You could not even You couldn't assist anybody or a family of a striker or a child of a striker, to the point where supposedly at a primary school in Wellington, the children of strikers, the other children were told they could not share their lunch with them.
Wow.
It was extremely strict. So much so that then the Watersiders tried to respond by issuing a whole lot of pamphlets themselves and having these illegal secret printing presses in which they tried to fight back. But I tell you, the thing that really surprised me about this. So let's have a listen from the leader of the Watersiders, was a guy called Jock Barnes. And let's have a listen to him talking about what happened.
The ship owners' representatives did meet us. They just said to us, "You're going to get threepence halfpenny an hour rise." That's our final word. That amounted to 8.9%, whereas every other worker in New Zealand had been given 15%. The Federation of Labour not only helped the government, but without the support it gave the government and scab-herding tactics of the Federation of Labour, the ship owners and the government couldn't have won.
Wow.
Yeah, there you go. So,
Jock
did you know
Barnes.
that? Did you know that there was that division on the left there?
No, I didn't. I did know that name. Don't know a lot about him, but he is one of the names that from the union movement that is stuck in the recesses of my brain somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. This is the bit that I didn't realise, that the Labour opposition was weak. It was Walter Nash, Peter Fraser had died in office, and they certainly weren't pro the emergency legislation or anything, but they weren't as perhaps vigorous as they should have been, or could have been, is probably the better word. But the Federation of Labour actually ended up backing the government, and the guy who was leading that was Patrick Fintan Walsh, and that was seen as absolutely crucial, and I didn't really realise that. And,
I think I recognise these names from reading Chris Trotter over the years, who's a slightly, I don't know, maybe obscure to some listeners, but he's
he's written a lot about the
well
left,
respected and highly intellectual journalist. Those are the sorts of names that you'd read, you'd see reading his stuff.
I mean, Michael King, in his book, I was looking for this, he said that Fintan Walsh
it's a great name, isn't it?
Well, was pretty much the closest thing New Zealand had to sort of an American style, not mob, but sort of union gangster type.
Right,
boss,
the Teamsters,
exactly,
our equivalent of the American Teamsters. Okay, yeah,
and you're absolutely right about the snap election. So Holland senses that the situation has gone his way with the Federation of Labour coming on board, and in fact probably large parts of the population, and calls a snap election on the basis of that, knows that there's fear about communism and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, okay. So that snap election was 51, was it? 1951?
Yes, I think that's right. It was towards the end of that particular strike. Hey, let's whip through now, and because I want to get to the Employment Contracts Act as quickly as we can, because I know it's an area you have done a little bit on, because I found some research where you had. Your name. 60s and 70s.
Doesn't say that I'll remember it, though, does it?
No, you'll remember. The 60s and 70s, dominated by negotiation between industry, unions and the government, and, you got Muldoon and Labour thrashing around. The awards became like a minimum. You had you had the ferry strikes, as you mentioned, that were coming through. Do you remember? And I just wanted to bring this up because I just thought it was hilarious. You'd remember Brian Edwards?
Oh yes, indeed. The broadcaster and later media advisor, and wrote a book on Helen Clark, I think, and I certainly know the journalist Brian Edwards.
Did you know that he resolved a strike?
Oh yes, wasn't he? Yes, he did that. He did that live on a broadcast, didn't he? Yeah, I remember reading that story.
Let's have a little listen. 1970. There's a strike at the post office, a go slow. So I suppose it's not quite a strike over wage negotiations. He manages to get in both sides of it into the studio and pretty much sorts it out. Let's have a little listen.
Can I take it now that you will go back to your members and ask them to consider calling off this go slow?
I will go back to my executive committee and I would recommend to them that they give consideration to calling off the strike.
If you give me a ring tomorrow and I can make my arrangements in my side.
Would you agree that we have reached some common ground now
and that the situation is perhaps a little more hopeful than it was 15 minutes ago.
I would think so.
I would think so.
Wow. I can't claim to
Isn't
have
that
done that.
amazing?
Have you ever solved a strike on
No,
air, Corin?
I've always kind of wished. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing?
I
mean,
listened to you with May Chen, which doing Morning Report on the morning that we're recording this, and that was a very interesting discussion about arbitration.
She was
and
very
unions.
interesting,
Yeah, I thought
wasn't
she was
she?
very interesting.
She was rolling out some pretty heavy-duty quotes too.
Yeah, there was a few references to some ancient Greek philosophers or something.
That's right.
But I couldn't quite say that you've resolved a strike that I've heard anyway.
And we should say, I mean, we seem to come across a lot of old broadcasters, don't we? I mean, Brian was a titan in his day.
Absolutely.
Absolute titan in his day. And you deserved a lot of credit for it. He got a lot of credit for that. Okay, so we've got 1970s, unemployment, inflation starts to become a problem. We know all those things. We've talked about them before. Let's get to old Jim Knox, just for the fun of it, because he was the guy who would have been at Muldoon's office thrashing out some, negotiation for an award. And here he is campaigning for Labour, I think, on behalf of Labour.
I'm going to call upon all trades councils, trade union committees, we have 25 of them now, spread right from the North Cape to the Bluff, and all our affiliated unions, no doubt the combined state unions who are working now very close with the Federation of Labour, to come out and work as they've never worked before, organise, collect finance to give you financial support, to speak at meetings, and I'll be doing just that myself, leading that, for the return of a Labour government in 1981.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that name and that, and I can see his face now because when I was a kid, and so I would have been, 8 or 9 at that point, and those faces and those voices were a big part of childhood. This was a family I grew up in who were fascinated in politics, and back in those days, you'd have broadcasts of a whole conference. It's probably from a Labour conference or something, is it?
Yeah,
a Labour
exactly.
Party conference.
It would have been,
and they'd broadcast the whole bloody thing, all day, not just clips on the news. I mean, it was a different country. It was bugger all to do. So people would actually listen to that sort of stuff.
Well, no, you're quite right.
Fascinating character and demonised on the right too, obviously, wasn't he? I mean, they hated him.
Yes. I mean, he cut his teeth on the waterfront strikes by all
Oh,
accounts,
did he?
and he worked his way up. He was a tough character, but he was the guy who was trying to do a lot of deals. He was the head of the Federation of Labour. There was one sort of general strike in New Zealand, maybe 1979. Didn't sound like it achieved a lot. It certainly didn't rattle the government. They had about 300,000 workers who took part in that. It didn't seem as though, from my research, that it was particularly successful. There was obviously the ferry strikes, but it's interesting when we butt into the Roger Douglas era. I mean, Knox was railing against Douglas and those guys, and what ended up happening during the Labour government is a couple of things, and you'll be able to help me here. I mean, Labour, while it was ripping up the script on everything in the economy, didn't actually go after industrial relations. I mean, it kind of left that alone.
That's interesting. And I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, but that is true, isn't it? And Jim Bolger, who I recall was a minister of Labour at an earlier part in his career, when he became Prime Minister, the Employment Relations Act that we'll talk about in a sec, that was the major change. I mean, that was the part of the unfinished business, I suppose, wasn't it? So Labour probably did leave that alone. Remember too, though, that they had Jim Anderton as a president in those years, and he would have taken a pretty dim view of
well, when we think of
into
conferences, what about that? Yeah, and that's maybe one for another context. I think back to when he was, the Labour Party was tearing itself apart over Rogernomics, and there was Jim Anderton just, giving it death in those Labour Party conferences with the young Ruth Dyson. It was young Ruth Dyson who was the president at the time. The most notable thing, I think, from that period so that's the Labour government comes in 1984, brings in the neoliberal reforms, but didn't really venture heavily into industrial relations reform, left that award system in place by and large. The combined trade unions, that's the CTU we know now, was formed. That came out of the Federation of Labour and the combined state unions because, of course, we had more middle class, we had more bureaucracy, we had more teachers, we had more nurses, and they became heavily unionised. a la what we're seeing a little bit more today. So those state unions became far more influential during that period. One little footnote there, Mike Moore, he came up with an idea, and again, Mike Moore, he does seem to have some quite good ideas. He, right at the end, so 1990 or something, came up with something called the Compact. That's
right. There's some sort of social compact or something, wasn't there? Yeah, some sort of societal deal. I can't remember the details. But
well, he reckoned that you got limited to pay rises of 2%, with bigger pay hikes needing to be linked to productivity gains in exchange for pay restraint and, that sort of thing. It never got anywhere because they lost, of course. And then, let's go to Jim Bolger, maybe talking to yours truly, I think might be the way to go. Let's have a little listen and you can help me out.
We had drafted the outline of the legislation, the Employment Contracts Act, to put greater responsibility back on the individual leadership in the unions and in the employers rather than the central bodies. Now, for years, we have very few strikes. People go to work, they know they're going to be employed, they know the job is there, they're not going to be on strike, they're not going to be on the picket line.
People would argue that it has dramatically reduced union participation in New Zealand. Did you think it would have that impact? We're now something below 20%, aren't we, in terms of participation in unions? Indeed, was that the desired effect?
No, that wasn't a goal. I mean, I've said endlessly that unions had a role and a function to play. I absolutely believe that workers have absolute rights to organise themselves, to have a common voice if that's what they want. And I could argue that, in fact, the unions are probably too small now to have the influence they should have.
Yes, I remember that. That's the interview we did for the Ninth Floor series and on former prime ministers. And I think that was one of the sort of headlines that people took out of it, and rightfully so, that the sort of, the author of the Employment Contracts Act, if you like, had said that it had gone too far and that unions didn't have enough power.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty extraordinary thing for him to say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose people need to remember too, especially those who are a little younger listening to this, but, I mean, the constraints on labour law were pretty strong to the point where, you didn't have, you couldn't open your shop on the weekend, you didn't have Sunday trading, you didn't have Saturday trading for quite some time. Do you remember that? I mean, those days?
Yeah, so when I started working in a cafe in Christchurch, it was really interesting. It was a popular cafe, but it didn't have it. It grew enormously as soon, the growth.
Right.
Really grew.
When they brought in Saturday trading.
When they suddenly could open up all these different hours, they went to 24 hours. It suddenly, it exploded.
You weren't working caffeines in the square, were you?
No, I was working in a place called Le Cafe in the Arts Centre.
Oh, yeah, I know it.
There's no harm in saying what it was. Yeah. It was a very popular cafe, and it was. But what was interesting, there were people working there who had been under the old system, who had time and a half, would have normally got time and a half, or double time for doing various shifts and things, But I'd turned up, and a lot of my friends who were working there, we were, didn't know anything about that. We just worked for whatever the hourly wage was and just checked and hoped we had a shift. If we were on the roster, we'd be happy. You worked hard and you got a shift, but there was no guarantee. It was very sort of... So that was the job security, arguably, but there was a job. And remember, what was the unemployment rate in 1993? You'd remember pretty well. I mean, it was massive.
Well, it peaked at... God, I'm going to sound like a geek here. It did peak... I'm going to say 11.2 is the figure that sticks in my brain, but it could be. It was around. It peaked at about 11% and about 92 from memory. It's something like that.
The figure
high.
I saw was about 9.5, nearly 10 when I was trying to work out when I would have been working. So I was so grateful to have a job, but it did herald quite a radical philosophical change in workplaces for New Zealanders, which arguably, even though the Employment Relations Act was then brought in by Labour, hasn't significantly changed back. I don't know. What do you think?
Oh yes, with Margaret Wilson, you mean that after Helen Clark took over in 1999.
So that softened it. It softened the Employment Contracts
Act.
Act.
But as Jim Bolger was saying in that clip we played from the Ninth Floor, I mean, unions were heavily diminished by the Employment Relations Act and never really recovered. I mean, certainly not in the private sector, right? So where are the big unions now? I mean, they are in the police, right? The Police Association, massively unionised. teachers are still massively unionised, doctors and nurses are still massively unionised. So those kinds of positions, and they're usually state agency positions, are still heavily unionised. But like in our own profession, I mean, that unions still exist, but they don't have much clout and nothing close to what they used to.
Union membership plummeted after the Employment Contracts Act. It was up around 50%, 600,000 workers, and now, for example, it's 14.5%.
Is that right? Okay.
And you know what's really interesting? And I keep double-checking this, and someone may prove me wrong, but it's Australia's union membership is actually lower than ours at the moment.
Is that
They're
right?
At 13.1%, which I couldn't believe.
Yeah, I thought, and I think I've said on this program that Australia had quite strong unions. So that was always the sort of narrative.
Here's the difference.
Yeah,
here's the really key point. Here's the difference. So we ripped up, we brought in the Employment Contracts Act, and we brought flexible labour laws, right? The flexibility was, and the goal was to make us more productive if we were more flexible and get the economy going. And we can debate, people will debate till the cows come home about whether that worked or not. In Australia, we got rid of all the awards. So those industry-wide awards that set minimum standards for cafe workers or port workers or whatever it was. And then unions would add bits on top of that and do their own negotiations. But those awards were there as a backstop for standards, minimum standards, pay conditions and things. Australia didn't get rid of those. We scrapped them.
Yeah.
So they kept them. They've still got them. They've still got the awards.
Yeah, whereas
they don't...
They're seen as laughable here, aren't they, when a political party tries to reintroduce those? They're seen as, they get mocked, don't they?
Well, why don't we jump there? Jacinda Ardern did try with her fair pay agreements, but it was only for two. It was like bus drivers, and I can't remember what the other one was. It was very narrow. Of course, there was an irony in it that Jim Bolger was on the working group having a look at it.
Maybe after
we got Jacinda Ardern. Should we have a little listen to Jacinda Ardern on that?
We've had employers say, actually, in this particular industry, we would like to have, minimum standards so that we can maintain good health and safety, decent standards of living for our employees, and it means that we remain competitive with other people who might try and contract.
Of course, it was the first thing that National scrapped. They're gone now.
That was never going to survive a change of government, was it?
No, but it is interesting, that you're not wrong with that theory, I don't think, about Australia in the sense that because they arguably kept those awards, it acted like more of a backstop. I mean, New Zealand's got a reasonably robust minimum wage system and has generally increased its minimum wage. Most governments, sometimes not as much of inflation, but it's seen as though the thing that governments do every year.
Yes, relative. I think that I've seen figures that relative to the average wage or the median wage in New Zealand is fairly high in OECD terms, isn't it? In terms of what the minimum wage is.
Yeah, no, I think New Zealand, and certainly under the last Labour government, they obviously ramped it up as hard as they could to the point where businesses were starting to really
starting to squeal a bit, weren't they?
Yeah, and then this government has slowed the pace down, but it hasn't stopped. Yeah, I mean, so the Employment Contracts Act, radical change, really. I'd be interested to know your thoughts, what you think about this. Yeah, so some people, because you talked to Bolger about this, this idea of did it deliver the productivity gains and the economic gains that we wanted as a country, or was it just cheap labour for firms? Those are the two sort of competing arguments. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I can't quite tell, and there's divided views on that. I think probably it leans on it just provided cheaper labour. It was probably like Brian Easton's and people like that, economists would say. But
I mean, that's incredibly politically contentious, isn't it?
It is.
Really. Jim Bolger's view in that interview was that it had gone too far and diminished the power of the unions too much and allowed the employer in that relationship to take advantage of workers, and that had meant that wages and productivity hadn't been what they had hoped, and he felt that needed some rebalance. And it was probably those kinds of comments which saw him getting asked by Jacinda Ardern's Labour government to be involved in some of those panels and things. But it certainly was his view that in retrospect that it tipped too far to the employer.
It's pretty interesting, that he thought that. I listened to around a bit, and one interview, Roger Kerr, who was the head of the Business Roundtable for a long time. He was on Catherine Ryan reflecting about his time, and he argued, very strongly that those changes, along with, were instrumental in delivering. And, and he had his own productivity gains were massive for New Zealand. And even though, and that we came out the other end of the 90s in a much better position. So, I mean, people will argue, as you say, I think it's just it falls along political lines.
Yeah, it does. And it's just such a different world, and our attitude to work is so different too, isn't it? I mean, we live now in a gig economy where, someone might do half a job here and then Uber drive on the side, and that same person expects to be able to buy something pretty much 24/7 and expects places to be open all the time. And that's, those expectations are very hard to pull back, aren't they? So, you might be listening to this and think, oh, it's really not fair on the worker, but then you have to ask yourself whether you are prepared to have those limits that we did have with that. Because, I mean, Jim Bolger talked about that too. You couldn't shop on a Saturday, or you couldn't, I see even out today, Brooke Van Velden, who is the minister in charge of this area today. I haven't studied it, but she's looking at changes to some of these labour laws and to holidays acts and things like that. But yeah, so it depends what societal expectation is, isn't it? And often when you have a lot of freedom and you have the individual's right to go and do whatever they want, whenever they want, that is going to have an equal and opposite effect on the other side in terms of conditions and rights and protections and things. So yeah, that really is the sort of political dividing and fight line.
Definitely. And it's been interesting to look at the industrial relations over the last 10 or 15 years. Obviously, so Labor brought in the Employment Relations Act, Margaret Wilson, this was Michael Cullen and Helen Clark, and that did soften some of the harder edges and make changes to the Employment Contracts Act. It brought in an idea of good faith bargaining, which is pretty central, this idea that, both sides have come on, it's got to be in good faith, and that's been a pretty core, that was Margaret Wilson's core principle there. And there's been plenty of tinkering on both sides of the political divide ever since then. One, Left or Labor will come in, they'll make changes, the 90-day firing.
Well, that was interesting, wasn't it? So the 90-day trials. So John
That's
Key
been back
was
and forth a few times.
Yeah, John Key was very big on that. That first came in
that's back
under John
now,
Key,
so,
and now it's back, yeah. But he extended it, didn't it? Because it started with just for SMEs or people with under 20 employees, I think, and then was it extended out more widely? Was it to all businesses?
I think it might be. I'd have to double check that. It's certainly back now, and then there's even a fire at will type legislation. I was talking about it on Morning Report this week, where for anyone earning over $180,000, you can't take a personal grievance.
Yeah,
because I guess you're deemed to be financially well off enough that. That's in the pipeline or in the process of coming through. There was a couple of other figures that I thought are absolutely worth a mention, and one of them is Helen Kelly, and she was CTU boss for a long time, a remarkable woman who's no longer with us, died a few years ago. She kind of led the CTU in a slightly different direction in that she focused obviously very hard on workplace safety, 0-hour contracts she fought against. Yeah. But she showed again that leadership in that role, can have a big influence, and she was very influential. Let's have a listen to her.
We are the push to the pull, really, in terms of making sure that working people have a voice in this country. And the reality is that 75% of Kiwis earn their income by working. They don't have any other form of income. They don't have rentals, they don't have shares, they don't have savings. In 2012, 50% of Kiwis had less than $300 in the bank. And so it's incredibly important that ability to earn a living is preserved.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had a little bit to do with her journalistically. A couple of things I remember from her was her work with the when Peter Jackson and the big Hollywood studios were coming in, and they were worried about labour conditions, and there was a big thrashing out with Key but she actually did cross the aisle quite well, I thought, and did work with that national government. The other thing, I remember doing a TV story for TV3, I think it was 60 Minutes at the time. Might have been Third Degree, I changed the name, lost the licence or something. But on the forestry sector and the incredible and harrowing deaths that you saw in the forestry sector, and she was really instrumental in trying to improve conditions there. So yeah, she did a lot of great work.
She did indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of this context. I have to say it was
I'm on overtime now, mate. So you've breached my conditions.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I'm about to go on holiday, so I'm not sure what my holiday pay is, because that might have changed.
That might
as
have
well.
changed. Yeah, go and talk to Tex Brooke Van Velden.
There's something going through the Parliament as we speak. Hey, good to talk to you, Guyon. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll catch you again next week.